Welcome to Science Sunday. Here we are again. Happy March, everyone. Weather's been a little bit nicer. Tough February we all got through, but I've been out on my bike yesterday. I rode 43 miles or so, and so I got a nice ride in, and happy to be here on Science Sunday with you. Welcome all you science lovers out there. Thanks for tuning in, whether you're here right now live or tuning in later. I think we've had 70 people or so signing up for some of the Science Sundays coming in at the time or later, and so that's really nice. It's a community that's holding together because I think we're doing interesting things and at least entertaining you with our...
I saw you do something interesting just a few minutes ago.
What was that?
I can't talk about it live here.
All right, good. Well, today I wanted to talk about inventions, and I had this broad scheme and how inventions impact us, not only how we impact the world with our inventions, and it's based on this book, The Alchemy of Us. A very interesting book by Anissa Ramirez. I think it's her first book. She's a materials scientist and a science communicator, and so she writes about how different inventions, different material changes in the world, not only, and her emphasis is not only how we change the world by inventing things, but also how the world impacts back on us. I recommend the book very much. If you have an opportunity to get it, it's fairly new out there. So one of my Christmas presents, when my kids ask me what I want for Christmas, I say science books. And so I think my daughter Jessica out in Seattle got this, who's an engineer, and sent it out to me, and her husband Will. So very interesting book. There's so much in it, it could form a lot of talks, and as I started formulating for today's talk, I had to keep restricting down to things that I could kind of hopefully bring a whole to. So there may be more topics in here, or you may enjoy the book and see this could be a taste of the book for you as well too. So again, welcome to Science Sunday and happy March. Before we talk anything about science, I think we've got to at least touch base about perseverance and ingenuity.
I try to have both.
Yes, and we actually have both, and we have both of them on Mars right now.
That's amazing.
Yeah. I don't know, I talked a little bit about it, but here's the picture of the Perseverance Rover that we landed on Mars, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And you can see in front of it a picture of something that was strapped to its underside and will be dropped down onto the Martian landscape in the next week or two.
Looks like a virus, Mike.
Yeah, they're very similar things. Spins a lot faster, though, actually.
Yeah.
This is a double-bladed helicopter. It'll be mankind's first attempt at powered flight on another planet. And it was a whole team of people that got involved with this, and that's the small little helicopter named Ingenuity.
Do you know what that is? I haven't read much about it. Does it just have cameras, or what kind of sensors are on the little helicopter? Do you know?
They're not trying to do science as much to explore and to find things with this Ingenuity. It's more of a technological proof. The atmosphere on Mars is like 1% of the atmosphere on Earth. And so to have anything that counts on lift and pushing against atmosphere to get it off the ground, it takes a whole bunch of different types of engineering marvels to be able to do this. There's a double-bladed, double foil on this thing, one above the other, and the engineering of it, the mathematics of it, has them rotate in opposite directions. So if you think of the clutches and bearings and different motors and drives that make these things rotate in opposite directions to get the maximum amount of lift, rotating at somewhere, I think a helicopter blade rotates at something like 100 RPM, something like that. Maybe a little bit more than that. I didn't check, and I'm not positive about that. But
I can look it up while you're talking.
Okay. These things rotate at somewhere around 2,400 RPM, just to push against enough air or enough atmosphere to be able to get this thing off the ground. Also, you probably know that it's about an 11-minute cycle time, a delay time from signals being sent from one planet to get to the other, Mars to Earth. So there's no way that any joystick rider on Earth could actually move this thing around and control it. And most of all that they do on this thing is pre-programmed, planned types of efforts. So I think they're trying to prove a design, a concept kind of idea that this can work, that it's effective, and it can potentially be some way of getting people around in the future on Mars if you scale this small attempt up to something
For
much
all
larger.
those sightseeing helicopters that people are going to start
Right,
wanting
right.
to take on Mars.
I would take one.
Yeah.
That would be pretty amazing.
Their typical helicopter is 450 to 500 RPM,
Okay.
according to
It's
Mr.
good
Internet.
to get that cleared. All right, and this is about 5 to 6 times the speed, and a double helix on this thing. And very lightweight. I think the thing weighs about 2 kilograms, somewhere around 4.5 pounds, the whole thing. So they're not trying to load it down with experiments, not do a lot of things. You can see it as a solar panel on top, and they're going to ramp up the levels of work that they do with it. But anyways, that's an amazing wonder, and the rover above it is amazing. It's actually based on or built on the capacities of the Curiosity and the other rovers that have been on Mars.
It's a real cutie, I got to tell you that.
Yeah,
That's quite
yeah.
a,
It's
quite a
it's
glamour
somewhat
shot.
anthropomorphic, isn't it? You
Yeah.
see a head and a neck and everything. So I'm sure Disney will be having a lot of fun with that in the future. But that has 23 cameras on it. I think about 5 times as many cameras as Curiosity and Rover did. And if you have not had an opportunity, I hope you get to take the opportunity to look at some of the pictures it's taking are just phenomenal. Just clear as day and just beautiful. Clear as a Martian day, I guess.
Yeah.
So anyways, that's a fascinating thing. The capacity, the one amazing engineering thing was getting it to land properly and safely on Mars. Originally, some of the smaller ones, some of the smaller rovers that they land earlier, they actually encased them in large
Beach balls.
yeah, beach balls, large plastic or whatever, air-filled or gas-filled spheres that they actually kind of bounced their way along the planet as they came out of the sky. They were slowed down immensely prior to that, but this one came in a little bit different way, which I'll talk about. And the one thing that's amazing, another thing that's amazing to me is the fact that I think the last course correction that they did on the rover on the vehicle that was bringing the rover to Mars was something around a month and a half ago.
Wow.
They had to fire no rockets or anything else. The attitude correction and everything was so perfect that they had no problem getting it in its path and in its way to go. I said a month ago, I believe, that it's akin to landing this rover where they wanted to on a very rocky place, and they decided they could do this for the reasons I'll talk about in a minute in a much less suitable landing spot. It's akin to getting it to land there is akin to throwing a dart in Washington, D.C. and hitting the bullseye in Dallas, Texas. So,
Wow.
pretty amazing. This is, and I hope it can come out well for you at home.
Maybe the AV, our helper, can zoom in on this for a minute.
Right. So this shows somewhat of the path of it. I'll turn a little bit sideways so I can see it in better view here too. But basically, up at the top left is the outer stage separation. That's when the thing that got the rover into position, ready to do the next things, is no longer necessary, and they start jettisoning the top portion of this booster. And it starts entering into the atmosphere of Mars. And it's going at this time somewhere around 12,000 miles an hour. And so it has a heat shield. Even the small atmosphere on Mars would burn this thing up, the friction that was caused. So this heat shield was there, and you can see that going into entry into lower positioning, peak deceleration. They're coming around this time. All this time, remember, all the signals it's sending back are something like 7 minutes delayed. So no one knows what's happening. It's 11 minutes delayed, and there's 7 minutes of time from the beginning to landing in here. So it had already landed on the planet before people knew what was going on next or what to do about it, or had no chance to do any corrections.
It was all on its own there, pre-programmed, right?
Pre-programmed, right, developed with, and pre-programmed and also programmed with the capacity to adjust itself, to pre-adjust its programs.
Wow.
So it slowed down as it comes through that S-curve there, and it's a guided entry, all by the pre-programs. And at a point that it slowed down to a much slower speed, they deployed a parachute that's the size of a Little League baseball field up above. And you can actually go on YouTube and see pictures of this happening. NASA.gov, or other just YouTube, and type in Perseverance. You'll have a wealth of things to look at here, and I highly recommend you do it. They're looking for this Jezreel Crater, which looks, for all intents and purposes, is supposed to be an ancient lake bed, sort of like Crater Lake in Oregon or different things like that. And so they feel that's a great place to see evidence of early life. The parachute deploys, and at that point it's going slow enough that they drop the heat shield. And at that point that you see kind of in the middle of this slide, there's actually cameras deployed down that can look, all sorts of infrared cameras and photo cameras.
Radar. Yeah.
Radar, everything else. And then this entry vehicle has been programmed with maps that show exactly the crater, the area that they're looking at here. And they can take pictures, and then the rover itself evaluates, or the vehicle itself evaluates those pictures and locks into something that's known in its memory and knows possible landing spots to aim for, what it should potentially do about it. So it can adjust, it can shoot rocket pulses to try to adjust it, to move to spaces. And once it acquires a target now, it's homed in, and that's what it's going to aim for. So the terrain relative navigation solution is developed, that they call it, once it's radar locked. And once it knows exactly where it's going for, and it has this target, now it drops off the top part. The parachute is separated, and the whole back shell is separated. And this small part comes out here, and there's what they call the sky crane holding the rover and the ingenuity underneath it. And that is coming down with nothing holding it at all except rockets firing to move it to proper space. And you can see that in that powered descent. Once it got to about 70 feet or so, it deployed, it let out on cables the rover, and it continued to go down. You could see pictures of this with the rockets blowing up dust and everything out of the way, and the rover was deployed and lowered down to the ground safely, at which point the cables were disattached, and this sky crane position then flew away somewhere about a mile away and then crash landed, basically. It got out of the way so it wouldn't land on top of the rover. And all this was done in pre-programmed measure, and an amazing, amazing thing. So, touchdown. I was going to show you some pictures. I know we have time troubles here. I realize I can't get to everything I'd love to get to.
We'll just have to do more Science Sundays, Mike.
Yeah. So I highly recommend you look into some of these YouTube pictures, NASA.gov or some other areas, and I think you'd really enjoy watching. Now they have it traveling around and going to different parts of the Jezreel Crater, and the Perseverance is looking into what's going on there and sending pictures back. It's taking soil samples. Some of those soil samples are being analyzed right there. Some are actually being stored away in a library that will be then available years from now when maybe another vehicle can go
Yeah.
there and get those soil samples and bring them back to Earth, and we can evaluate them, in an Earth laboratory.
Maybe
too.
Mark Watney, the Martian. I recommend that movie, by the way. It's
yeah.
got a lot of pretty amazing and plausible science. About the only thing that isn't scientific is the windstorm right in the first few minutes.
Oh, really?
But almost all the rest of the movie is pretty amazing with regards to the science.
It
And-
might put you off potatoes for a while, though.
yeah, it may. Yeah.
Here's, if you can copy this down or come back to this when you choose to, this is like an hour-long romp by the Perseverance through the Jezreel Crater, and they kind of apply it to music and some not choral music, but orchestral music. And it's pretty fascinating. You can just kind of get entranced watching that. So if you have an opportunity, check that out.
I hope that they don't play Chariots of Fire during the...
That's kind of dated. So, anyways, let's move on to my topic of other inventions, but that's a pretty cool invention and needed to get noticed. Did you know that November 18th of 1883 had 2 noons in New York City?
2 noons?
2 noon. The bells rang at St. Peter's Church. It's still there in New York
Yeah.
City. And 4 minutes later, they rang 12 times again. They rang 12 times and another 12 times.
Was it one of those leap minute things? They did a leap 4 minutes or something?
Yeah, there was some level of correction going on, and it
Yeah.
has to do with invention. And
Aha!
also, did you know that at one time, at about that same time, Michigan actually had 27 time zones?
No, I had no idea.
27 time zones. Indiana, 23.
Everybody, it's like every block had its own time zone almost.
Yeah, it's pretty close. It was different regions, different areas. Illinois had 27 time zones. We had 27
Wow.
time zones in Illinois. But we were all bested by Wisconsin, as we always are in football and everything else, by Wisconsin. They had 39 time zones in Wisconsin in the late 1800s.
Wow.
And you have ideas of why that might be?
Well, in the late 1800s?
Late 1800s.
Well, let's see. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it was astronomical noon. They based it on when the sun was at the meridian overhead.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to say when noon is, right?
Yeah.
It's somewhat of a construct, a mathematical construct, a developmental construct. How do we say when noon is? Why would it be important to have noon be the same in Wright Pond, Wisconsin, as it is in Fond du Lac or something like that?
Well, trains. I know that the standardization of a lot of timings across the U.S. came about because of the growth of the railroads and the need to literally schedule things.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you think that you're at noon because you're in Wright Pond time, but you're at 12:08 because you're in Fond du Lac time, and all of a sudden another train's right in front of you.
Yeah.
So it helped quite a bit. When people were agricultural, living in nature, whenever the astronomical time was, when the daylight was up above you, when the sun was highest in the sky, you'd call that noon. The Greeks did a lot of that. They put big sticks in the ground, and they saw when the shadow was shortest, and so on. In fact, that's one of the first ways that some early Greeks proved that the world was round. That they had down in Alexandria, because the Greeks had settlements and things down there. They put a stick in the ground and they measured the steepest, the shortest length of shadow, which would be noon there. And because that part of the earth wasn't tilted directly at the sun or aimed directly at the sun, there was still some length of shadow. And then they did it up in Macedonia or other areas in northern Greece, and they did things there in Athens, and they saw that actually the shadow lengths were different.
So Eratosthenes, friend of mine from way back when, knew that the Earth was round long before Columbus.
Right. Right.
And that knowledge was actually passed down to people in the know, people who learned folk. And so it's a myth that Columbus discovered that the earth was round. People knew about it for a long time.
Right, right. So, yeah, we're kind of getting along with the right ideas here, but so in early days, in agricultural times, when you planted your seeds or anything like that, when you harvested, had nothing really to do with what time noon was or whatever. You knew when the sun came up, you were up, needing to be up and working and tending your fields and so on. When the sun went down, you rested, and people lived their lives that way. And there's some interesting things about how people lived and so on that we'll be talking about a little bit about that too. But basically, I want to talk about how better clocks, made possible by advances in steel making, like small metal springs, and vibrating gems even, help us keep more accurate time, but they also lose something for us in return. Maybe something precious, and that's something we'll talk about more too. This woman here is an interesting person. You probably haven't heard of her before, Ruth Belleville. And she's interesting. Every week she'd get up. She lived in Maidenhead, which is western London, and like past on the Thames, but pass way out by. And she'd have to travel all the way from Maidenhead in western London to Greenwich. And she would get her chronometer, and you can see that man here is an assistant at the Royal Observatory at Greenwich. He's handing her a certification of her watch. So she took this watch, evaluated, and then she'd receive this document, and she'd walk down to the Thames, and she'd take a launch back into London. And then she'd stop in places. And for a £4, which could have been a few $100s a year kind of cost to people at that time, for £4 a year, she would come to you every Monday and she would show you Arnold. Arnold is her clock here, her chronometer. This is actually Arnold number 485. And she would show the clock to people at banks, maybe railroad stations, watchmakers, actually, astronomers, people that really needed to know accurate time. In those days, they were starting to get more laws made about when a bar had to close or a restaurant had to close, and so they didn't want to break the laws, and so they needed to know the time. This watch, Arnold, was made, like it says in the little blurb here, made in 1786. So at that time, I think George Washington was just our new president. We just developed, had a treaty of Paris in 1783. So this watch was made in 1786, and it was actually made for one of George III's sons. Okay, he lost the war, and his son got a watch.
Consolation prize.
Yeah, the Duke of Sussex. And Sussex is somewhere near Greenwich, parts of Sussex that are in that area.
So sorry about those colonies, but here, have this watch.
Yeah. So he thought it was so big. You can see it in her hand in the prior picture, and it's not enormous. In fact, I think I have another picture too that shows it. Her holding it in the bottom, and I don't know how well that shows up for you. I think it shows up pretty well in this one. Can you see it pretty well, Scott?
Yeah, you can see
Size
it
of
okay.
her palm.
Maybe you can zoom in on that just for a second so people can get a good view of it.
Well, you can get a good view.
Oh yeah, you can definitey see it
Yeah, you can see
in
it
her
in her
hand.
hand.
Yeah.
And she's giving the
Thank you.
time to someone at a railroad station here, and he's setting the time each. The reason is that a lot of these clocks weren't as accurate as people would have thought they were. Again, this is Arnold number 485. It was called Arnold, and she called it Arnold because it was John Arnold was the watchmaker of it. So it was his 485th watch. So he was getting pretty good at it by that time.
Yeah.
So remember that date, 1786, because we'll be talking about dates and how watches were made and what's going on through there. So she'd go to newspapers and bars and watchmakers and stores and restaurants and railroad stations and so on, and get their time set up. They'd look at her time. This watch was accurate to a couple of tenths a second, a tenth of a second in a day.
Wow.
Pretty good for what was going on in 1786,
Oh, yeah.
when you think of it. Pretty amazing. And why is it that watches could be that accurate at that time? Even the other clocks and the things that they had were nowhere near as accurate. This was a special watch for its time. It was much more accurate than most, much more capable of keeping accuracy.
So Arnold's siblings weren't as accurate?
Oh no, other Arnold watches were, it's just that not many of them were made.
Oh, I see.
Not many of them were made, and it's an interesting story because we'll look here. Okay. Here she is in her older days. She actually did this until 1940.
Really?
She still had...
From 1786 to 1940?
No, the watch was made in 1786.
Oh, I see.
And there's a little history to her too as well. But she actually, the reason she retired was because it was a little dangerous to walk the streets in 1940 in London.
I can't imagine why.
Yeah, there were bombs dropping from the air.
Oh,
So that's
yeah.
when she retired, actually. But if we look on, we see it started first with her father, Henry, in 1836. So the watch was, what, 70 years old, something like that by then? The Duke of Sussex, I think you saw in the earlier slide, wasn't very happy with this watch. He called it a warming pan. He thought it was as big as a warming pan. He wanted something smaller. Maybe he didn't care. He could have someone else carry a watch around and tell him accurate time, but he didn't like it very much. So he ended up giving it because he was somewhat aligned with the Royal Observatory. He gave it to Greenwich Royal Observatory, and they had it. Well, in those days, in the 1780s, 1790s, 1800s, people were coming in all the time. A certain group of people were coming in to get their watches calibrated because watches were very inaccurate at that time. And they got tired of doing this. They had other work to do. And Henry's father was Ruth's father was a scientist at the time, but he agreed to go out on this travels through London. So in 1836 he started doing it, and he did it for 20 years. In 1856 he died, and his wife needed a way to help support her 2-year-old daughter at the time, Maria. So her 2-year-old daughter Ruth. So Maria, Henry's wife, started traveling as well. So she did it for 36 years.
Wow.
Went around from 1856 to 1892, giving the time to people of London, all on a subscription type of basis. And then it was still in demand later on, and from 1892 to 1940, so a total of 48 years, Ruth, the daughter, brought this watch around and calibrated people's time throughout London. It is true that the subscriptions dropped. There were a lot less people. Some people did it as a matter of support for Ruth and the family. Some people did it because this was a very accurate watch, but there were getting to be ways that you could calibrate watches by radio signals now and telegraph signals and so on. So people, for a lesser price, could get someone else or some other means of doing it. But she had an accurate watch and she did it. What's interesting to me is maybe what this kind of signifies and what means from there. And what was special about Arnold 485 and all these watches that Arnold made, some he made that were made to be the best. This one was gold encased originally. Henry cased it in silver because he thought it would get stolen on the streets of London if he walked around with a gold watch.
Yeah, it was made for a prince.
Right.
Yeah, so.
Yeah. And some were made more accurately. Arnold made some less accurately for less money and so on. So he had a variety of watches. But special things about Arnold 485 and watchmaking at that time I wanted to talk about. And this will start getting us into some inventions, I think, too. It was reliable and it was accurate. Amazingly accurate. Like I said, a couple tenths of a second in a day, in a time when people were still thinking, like we've talked about before, you cure people of diseases by bleeding them and so on. They were able to make these watches this accurate.
I wonder
And-
how they measured it. I mean, what was this, was there a better clock somewhere that allowed them to know it was a tenth of a second off?
I would say that, no, I'd say this watch is still around, you know, and they're testing it now.
Oh, testing it now, okay.
Yeah. But yeah, it had, and it was actually tested. That's why she would go first to the Greenwich Observatory to have it tested against the main clock that was there.
Which was probably set by some like the sun crossing the meridian or some
Right.
astronomical event.
Right, which is the whole purpose of why Greenwich later on was named as the Great Meridian
Yeah.
and so on. We basically base it, everything on science is based on some level of a determination that this is noon, right?
Or some standard we
Right.
make,
We
yeah.
make a standard or make an observation and work from that. So this was able to keep time that corroborated with that to a great extent.
AJ said it was quite a family business they had going there.
Yeah. It dwindled, but it kept them going.
Yeah.
So the reliability and the accuracy, which I want to talk about some more. And the first thing I want to tell you about that is Benjamin Huntsman and steel. First of all, steel in those days and way before had been made in interesting ways. It's fascinating if you look at the history of how steel is made and what steel really is. You know, steel is basically iron with a little bit of carbon added to it, and maybe a few other alloys. I work with steel pretty much at my work, and we work with so many different alloys of steel. Some are made to be shock resistant. They're very resistant to breakage. Some are made to be sharp as anything, and they can cut beautifully. You know, and the interesting thing is, it's usually a seesaw. As you gain sharpness and so on, you lose shock resistance. And we'll talk about that some more as well too. But we work with a lot of different steels for our purposes, and each one is made and alloyed very carefully to do a certain perform a certain task. Okay. So this is kind of just a thing helping you understand the course I'm going to try to take about it a little bit. I'm going to talk about steel making a bit here, and calling it an invention, iron with a small bit of carbon in it. Like I said, iron is about steel is about 95% iron, and then ranging from 1 to 4% carbon, or less even, and some other little bit of alloying, anything from molybdenum to sulfur to vanadium, tungsten, all sorts of different things to give it different qualities. So we'll kind of do a touch of that steel making thing for a bit. And we'll take that into watchmaking and how that invention of different types of steel improved watchmaking. So that's a technology kind of function. We already talked a little bit about selling time, and I'll circle back to Ruth Belleville and talk about that as an industry or as a way of making a living and so on. And then I want to go on and maybe wax philosophical about our changing lives as a result of all this. So, steel making. Steel properties, roughly 95% iron with some additives. There's a balance that it's always worked to achieve between toughness and hardness. Very hard to get both of them. You have some areas that make a steel very, very strong and tough, and some areas that make it very hard. There's a classic demonstration that's talked about a lot, a sword, and I'm kind of used to it, so I'll talk for that a little bit, but we're going to mainly go into watchmaking. The levels of carbon are really the function of it all that are important to talk about first, and the impurities that come out because of all this. So, Benjamin Huntsman, he was born in 1704, and he was a watchmaker, but he wasn't that good of a watchmaker. In fact, nobody was that good of a watchmaker in those days. They'd probably beat us trying to make a watch with what they could do and so on. You know, they kept building on each other's ideas, but there were some certain problems that came along with watchmaking. And so we'll talk about that as well, too. So that's some of the things we'll cover in the history of steelmaking. Henry Bessemer is another interesting guy, although he doesn't apply so much into watchmaking. He really developed ways to make steel economically. In 1813, we still talk about Bessemer steel and the methods of doing that. So I'll introduce you to a little bit of that as well, too. Big developments in steelmaking. So originally, there were a couple of types of iron. And iron, again, is an element. It can be pure. It can be adulterated with a few imperfections. It can be added with some additives to it that make it change somewhat. And if you think of the types of iron they are, you can think of basically a seesaw. You gain and you lose. There's wrought iron, has a carbon content less than 0.1%. So it's very pure iron, okay? As compared to a cast iron. And a cast iron starts getting, usually they were casting iron by heating it up and melting it and pouring it, and so there was always, in early days, there was heat involved, and how do you get fire and heat? By burning things. When you burn wood or different things, then you're putting carbon into that whole system. So carbon gets infused with that. Wrought is how you'd think of like a blacksmith pounding on things and heating it up slightly and pounding things around. Cast is more of pouring things into a mold. Okay. Wrought iron with very low carbon in it is very, very tough. It'll stand up to beating. You know, if you have a shield and someone's going to beat on it with a mace, you'd probably like to have a wrought iron kind of shield. It's very tough. But it has its problems too. The cast iron, on the other hand, is very hard. So a cast iron is just harder than anything. It's something, if you had a sword made of cast iron and you threw it up in the air and you sliced a feather with the cast iron, it would cut it simply, right? Very, very easy, hard, and able to be a hard, sharp kind of thing. You can get a very good edge on it.
And good for skillets.
Right. Malleable and ductile is wrought iron. It's been worked by a blacksmith and so on, so it's very pliable. It moves around. Ductility is somewhat about how if you take it and hold it with two strong things and pull it apart, some iron would just snap, and that would be cast iron, and some irons would pull very long before they'd break. So one breaks off very quickly. It's brittle, the cast iron. You probably see if you'd bang on a cast iron skillet, it would actually, part of it could break off pretty easily. Other things, corrosion resistance and wear resistance and different things like that. Wrought iron is highly refined. It's worked and you know what's in it, and cast iron is usually heavily alloyed with carbon and a bunch of different things. You can see the carbon content, I think I skipped past that, of cast iron is 2 to 4%. All the steels, we work with what's generally called tool steels at my shop. And those tools can make knives that cut parts of cans out, or they form coins, or they form Weber skillet lids and so on. We make tools that do all that. The carbon content is always between 1 and 2%. 2% is high, very high. So a cast iron is not a tool that will last a long time for you in our way of looking at it, at least.
So all those carbon atoms must sort of interrupt the lattice for the steel atoms, the crystal lattice. It's very interesting when you get down to a microscopic level what's going on.
Yeah. So historically, whenever weapons or parts wanted to be made, and weapons were some of the first items that were made with steel, the plows also, there was a balance here. This seesaw had to be achieved. Too brittle, and your plow would break in the ground, right? You know, too malleable, and it'll bend once it hits a rock. So it's a very important, tough balance to get. And the first way, you may have heard of it, I don't know, it probably isn't the first way, but the first way I want to talk about to achieve this is Damascus Steel. You may have heard of Damascus Steel. what people found out was they wanted the qualities of each of those steels. So they'd take one of each steel, put it on another. Actually, they'd make it 7 high. They'd have a wrought iron, and then a cast iron, and a wrought iron, and a cast iron, stack it up 7 high. They'd heat it up, and they'd pound it. A smith would pound it, pound it, pound it. It would have to expand to twice its width and twice its length and be much thinner. Well, now you have a big plate of steel, and you pounded these things together. And then not steel really, but you have this plate of iron. Then they take it and cut it in 7 equal sections, right? Well, now there have been 7 thicknesses to this, and now they put those 7 on top of each other. 7 times 7 is 49 different levels of wrought, cast, wrought, cast, wrought, cast, wrought, cast, all the way up. Heat it up again, beat it all out to a big, wide shape, saw it another time. They'd do this 4 or 5 times and get astronomical levels. In fact, it got down to be virtually in a small plow or a sword, it would get down to levels of almost an atom of each kind. Right?
Wow.
So back in early days, they were able to alloy their steel, make things up that were then much more usable for them. It had qualities of toughness because it had layers of the wrought iron in it, and right above it, it had qualities of hardness and sharpness, able to keep an edge because it had qualities of cast iron in it, and it had by molecule, up and up and up. They had these fantastic levels and capacities of steel. So
Wow.
it was a pretty interesting means and ways of doing it. It took a lot of brawn, took a lot of work to do it, but they got some of the most magnificent types of product out of it. This is the wood grain pattern in Damascus steel. Because it was pounded and heated and everything, things swirled around there, and it was very, very artistic, actually. The law of 7 is that 7 cuts and laying things in there, and just beautiful, beautiful aspects of the steel and qualities that were just immeasurably better than the raw material that they started out with. But this wasn't, and this was what they used not just for swords or plows, but this is what they'd use to make clocks, watch pieces, okay?
The same kind of folded steel, huh?
Yeah, they didn't have a lot of options, and they tried, different things. But the imperfections in this, you're pounding and you're at a smithy and you're pounding, and it just had imperfections. So if you made a spring out of a piece like this, you were certain to have imperfections in it, which would make your spring be very inaccurate.
Oh.
Right? Parts of the clock were made that were just not really effective.
So just sort of thinking out loud, the role of a spring in a watch then is just essentially to unwind at a very predictable and constant rate.
Right, right. I mean, there's different springs in the watches too. Some are, springs that set a certain amount of cadence going in the watch, and some just wind up the other mechanisms to make them work. But the balance spring is the critical one here that we're talking about.
Okay.
So Benjamin Huntsman was working with steel like this and getting results that were fairly poor, for at least compared to what he wanted. Any watchmaker that could make something that was more accurate would have great capacities, more long-lasting, spring wouldn't break on trips.
Yeah.
Good watches were the means by which you could tell where you were going east and west, because you could have a watch that was set to Greenwich Mean Time, and you could find out that at noon your watch said it was 3 o'clock, right?
So for measuring longitude, you need a good clock.
A good clock was essential for travel, amazingly essential, more than I'm even making the point. It was catastrophes happened, in foggy days in the English Channel when people didn't know where they were exactly. because they didn't have a watch and they couldn't see the sun and they couldn't see. So Huntsman decided, well, I can't get any better than what I'm doing. I'm putting all my effort into it, probably killing my eyes and my fingers and everything, and what do? He lived in Sheffield, in England, and he decided he needed a purer steel. So here's a picture that's an engraving that was made showing at his still existing factory there in the mid-1700s. It's not working right now, but the buildings are still there. On the right side, you see a laborer, a worker, and he's treading. Looks like he's doing the chicken dance. Mm-hmm. He's actually treading clay. He found special clay he took from special, very pure muds, and sometimes he actually took other people's pottery and crashed it up, broke it up, and he made it into clay. And these guys treaded it barefoot for hours. They'd have an 8-hour shift of treading clay. And you could find imperfections. You could stamp out all the air pockets. You could find a little imperfection and bend down and pick it up and throw it out and
wow.
go back to work.
Imagine putting that on your business card. I'm a clay treader.
Clay treader. And so they'd tread clay. And then the people on the other side are taking this clay that's as perfect as could be made, and they're making what is called a crucible. And a crucible is a large clay vessel that can take weight in it, that can take heat, and they're preparing these vessels because this is where he's going to make his perfect, more perfect steel. The thought was that he wanted to make his steel as a pure, fully melted item. When you're making Damascus steel, you're just beating on steel that's pretty hot and able to move around. But he wanted to make molten steel. And if you've ever seen pictures of a steel making foundry or so on, you get the idea of how to make better steel. 10 years of effort he put into this, and many failures. He finally succeeded. His idea was built on the concept of purifying the product by fully melting the steel. And here's the furnace room at Sheffield where he did a lot of his work, and those are crucibles from the 1700s. They're stacked out there. You can go and see them today.
Wow.
And those are used
Are there any
crucibles.
flights left today? I don't know.
Yeah. So people can go on tours and see steel making if you're really into it that much, and come back and tell me about it then. But crucibles are still stacked there. The idea was that impurities would float to the top. They could be skimmed off, and the molten steel that was in there was homogeneous, generic, was consistent, and then he'd pour this out, and they'd go through processes then, and he made better watches. His idea was stolen by people or used by people, borrowed by people, and many people. This became the new way to make steel. And then that burgeoned along a great increase in steel making. Steel was now much more useful because it was more consistent. They used steel to make railroad rails after this, and Bessemer got involved in a lot of that, and I won't talk too much about him, but actually an iron railroad rail could last, depending upon traffic and so on, but average of about 2 years.
Oh, really? Is that
all the iron railroad rails that got put out, the first ones in England, and when they came to America, they put out rails, they'd last 2 years, and you'd be replacing them.
Wow.
They'd be worn out by the wearing of the weight of the cars and the use of the time on them. Steel rails, 18 years. 9 times the life by some of these processes that were developed. Great inventions. Okay. Not only that, but they could hold 9 times as much, or last 9 times as long. They could also hold much more weight too, without deforming. The big issues in iron rails was that they deform very easily with any kind of weights. So now locomotives could get bigger. They could pull bigger loads, bigger trains, and it really, really, really impacted greatly the railroad industry. Okay. This is just a fast picture. Bessemer, if we talk about railroads, we ought to mention him at least. The Bessemer Furnace in operation still in 1941 during World War II. He found that if you'd put in oxygen, if you'd insert oxygen into the tank, actually from below, that it would be more than, you've seen it, people at a grill, they're blowing on the coals, and the common thought is that it adds oxygen, and oxygen is a combustible item, and so you get the fire going again. There's also an immense chemical reaction when you add oxygen into a steel process. And it was so immense that he actually, the first time he tried it, he burned the roof off of his building. It was like this fantastic, like much more than he ever expected result. And then he learned how to control it, and Bessemer steel became very, very important, pure and long-lasting, and so on. So, clocks and watches get perfected because of John Huntsman and ideas, and people came along like him. A little small, I'm sorry if you, hope you can read it. Late 1500s, when they first started making watches, they were kind of curiosity items, and only very, very rich people had it to show to others that they had a watch and so on. They lost maybe 3 to 5 hours a day in accuracy. Wow. Because they just would wind up and then they'd run down and wind up and run down. So you'd be continually not sure whether your time was that good. They're usually worn as jewelry. Women would have pendants, or men would have something like that. And they could, look at their watch.
They were still accurate twice a day, though.
Right. Well, maybe they wouldn't be. They were inaccurate all the time, probably. So, 1657, the balance spring was added. Now, this is before Huntsman, right? He was born in 1704. The balance spring added. Now watches could have minute hands. They didn't even have minute hands prior to this. Accuracy increased to around 10 minutes a day. So those are the kind of watches that Huntsman was unhappy with. Almost 100 years later, temperature compensation increased accuracy to a few seconds a day. They had like a lot of bimetal materials that they made, and John Huntsman's ideas. A bimetal is 2 different types of metals, one on either side of something, and then it would compensate well for heat changes or humidity changes or things. They could operate in counterbalance to each other to make the watch run more accurately. So these are steel improvements and technology improvements and so on that went on to here. But again, this is 1765. Most of them were a few seconds a day, 10 seconds a day maybe. But this is about when Arnold was made, to hold a few tenths of a second a day.
Wow.
Later on, jewel bearings. Instead of having steel bearings that would wear and drag and get finish problems and so on, jewel bearings, they would hold their perfection, they'd hold their size well. And lever escapements at this time. Escapement is a part of a watch that keeps it ticking back and forth. It's a click, click, click kind of thing. And those were made more accurately, better. In the 1950s, electric watches, you may have seen some of these. Electronic pulses. Actually, the electronic pulses were not as accurate as the best chronometers from the 1700s, although they were a lot cheaper. But they could keep pretty accurate time. Some of you may remember in 1964 what a big deal was made when the Tokyo Olympics came, and everything was timed with Seiko quartz watches at the Tokyo Olympics. And they had Seiko quartz and all the timing elements there, and they made a big deal about how accurate things were at that time too. And quartz is interesting too. I don't know if I want to take the time exactly on it, but quartz was developed because it has a quality of vibrating when it's electrified. It's piezoelectricity, which is actually developed or determined, not developed, but understood by Pierre Curie and his brother. So quartz, because it's a linear shape, like microscopically, like maybe diamonds and a lot of other metals are. But it vibrates when it's electrified, 50,000 pulses a second. So when you put electricity into it, then it vibrates at a rate that's knowable, and if you can control that and count that pulse, you can make a quartz watch, and that's what quartz watches are. There was one made in the 60s that was put in at New York City, and people at the home of, I think, AT&T, and people would go there at lunchtime to check their watches at that time. It was a 3-foot diameter watch, or clock, really. So, now we live by the clock. Everything we do seems tied into the clock. I'll meet you at such and such time. Work starts at such and such time. Dinner reservation so-and-so. But doing this has really changed how we live and sleep. People don't really know about this, but our ancestors slept differently than us. Basically, and I'm running low on time here like I always do, but basically they'd go to bed at around sunset. They'd tend to sleep about 3 or 4 hours, and they'd wake up sometime after midnight. Usually spend an hour or more kind of just bopping around, doing stuff, maybe even chatting with the neighbors who were up as well too, or doing a few different things. Reading a book, writing letters to people, writing in their diary, doing different stuff, and then they'd go back to sleep for another 3 or 4 hours. It seems like a natural type of thing was there. It's mentioned in a lot of areas, mentioned quite often. So we've changed how we sleep. I can go on with discussion. I've got examples of this, but I don't want to spend too much time on this. But it was the common way of sleeping. I think they've done studies where they've put people in mines or deep, dark places for months, and at the end of the month, they've changed their whole sleeping habit. They're back to like catnapping for 4 hours and then up, and their day kind of changes in length to a new day. So we're kind of forcing ourselves, and clocks have forced us into this way of looking at the world. But you know, that's maybe the price that we paid, which is a different way of living and a different way of looking at the world. It used to be you couldn't make it very easily to make an appointment with somebody to meet them at a certain time at a certain place, because no one knew accurately what time it was. So nowadays we can be much more precise in all that.
Well, that was one of the reasons church bells and whatnot, right, was to help the whole community know the time.
Right. And it used to be factories would have their factory sirens or factory horns go off, and that would tell people what to do. They'd change their clock at home to the factory time, and their life was lived by factory time. The people would know when the worker was coming home from work, and you know, when dinner was going to be, when they had to leave. Everything was established by community time that way, which might not be the same time as the next factory or the next town.
Right.
Okay. So we've been talking about the railroads, and time is very important, like Scott mentioned in the beginning, and I've said a few more times, to the railroads. If you have railroads that are running on different times, who knows when the train is going to get into the station in Vienna and when it's going to leave, and so on. Very critical. In fact, how do you keep accurate times, and how do you keep them consistent with other places? And actually, there was an Austrian patent officer who was seeing a lot of people coming up with suggestions and ways to keep track of time. And not only keep track of time, but communicate it with the other communities. How does everybody on this train line stay on the same time? And he started looking at this, and he saw some great ideas, some harebrained ideas. And one thing he started to say was that there were a few ideas a few hurdles, let's say, that had to be cleared before he would allow something to be even looked at for a patent. They talk about, you know, nowadays at a patent office, they won't look at perpetual motion machines because it goes against science. So he had to see that, he had to have it shown to him that this person's idea for a patent attended to, took into concept the amount of time it would take for a signal to be sent, let's say, from one place, and a signal to be received at another place. That was pretty important. Let's say, for example, you had a flare, and you were going to send up a flare every day at 10 at night when it's dark. And you sent up a flare. Well, if your idea for doing that didn't account for the time it would take for that flare to get up into the air and to get to a point where it was noticeable to a town 50 miles away or 20 miles away, it was not a good idea. He wouldn't take that as a patent. But
He was a particularly picky patent person.
particularly picky. So he developed this checklist to see if the ideas they had to display would even show this capacity before we'd even review them. Okay? And he started thinking about this more and more. Wait a second. There's this time essence of time itself, right? Time is not the same in some ways everywhere. When you see time is when other people see time. He started looking into this, and his other idea his other benefit of his being a patent officer in Austria was that he was looking at other people's ideas, which would give him a fresh onset of new thoughts all the time, but then he could take it home and go at these thoughts with himself. And he started thinking about time. Now, this flare, it's pretty obvious the time that takes for a flare to get up in the air, but he started thinking about what if he was on a train, and if he shone a flashlight straight up at a mirrored ceiling on the train, and then the light would come back down, and there would be a receiver down beneath it. Have you ever?
Now I know where you're going.
Like that?
Now I know where you're going with that.
So this Al, here's a picture of him, by the way, if you haven't caught on to the hint I'm getting at. Maybe that helps a little bit. But Al's job gave him some challenges, but it also gave him some freedom of time and thought. This is a picture of Al in age 25 in 1904. So Al started looking at some of these ideas in his spare time, and he realized that if he was on the train, if he was the person on the train seeing this, actuating the light, let's say, he'd see a light go up to the ceiling and come back down. Boom, boom. Okay? But what if you were an observer outside of the train on a station? Right as it went by the station, the guy inside would actuate the light. What you would see is the light leave here. If you had a capable enough detection device, you would see the light here, and by the time it hit the mirror on the ceiling, the train would be here, and by the time it was received, it would be way over here. Who's right on time? All this thing we've been trying to be so accurate about, all of a sudden, the observer on the train sees something different in regards to time and length of time and distance traveled in a time than the person on the ground or the person at the station. Think of it, maybe if you're having trouble, think of it a basketball dribbler. A basketball player, he's running up the court and he's dribbling. In his mind, he's pushing down and up. What he would see is a ball down and up and down and up and down and up. But the people in the stands are seeing a ball hitting or leaving a hand here. A few steps later, it's hit the ground. A few steps later, it's back up in the dribbler's hands again. Same concept, just with a different area of looking at it. And it doesn't matter if it's really a short amount of time. There is a difference in time. And this person, Al, was able to prove it. You want to say it?
No, go right ahead.
Okay. But we always strove to measure time more precisely. But in fact, time is not as precise as we thought. In fact, it's actually
Relative.
relative.
Yeah.
So that was Albert Einstein, actually. I'm sure most of you got that. Kids may not have seen that, but it's an amazing thing that all this led to Albert Einstein looking into theories of relativity. Here's one more picture that may help explain it a little bit. This is with a spaceship, but the one on top is showing a mirror and a detector and a source and a person standing in the spaceship, and they have a sign there that said 0.5 C What's that is saying is half the speed of light. So imagine this spaceship going half the speed of light, and that light is shown up above to the person inside the spaceship. He just sees it go up and down. Always sees it goes up and down, actually, no matter what speed the spacecraft's going at, right? But somebody on another spaceship down at the bottom looking as this goes by, while this is going at half the speed of light, they see this thing travel from that left side picture of when it leaves to up above to back down, and that's the way they see that light traveling. Okay? So, anyways, interesting aspects. I'm running low on time. I want to move on to my summation and leave any time for topics or thoughts. But basically, the results of our search for accuracy. Ruth Belleville and her family, I showed you, spent over 104 years, from her father to her mother to her, traveling the streets of London, providing the most accurate time possible to many people who saw the need for it. She stopped only during World War II for reasons of safety. Further developments allowed greater and greater accuracy, quartz and atomic clocks and so on, better precision. All this made us more and more able to measure something that I just showed you is somewhat relative and somewhat flexible in the first place. And we didn't even realize it until we were able to look at it closely. For a subscription of £4 a year and possibly an occasional spot of tea, Ruth brought precision but also a touch of humanity to her customers, sharing banter and a bit of news, and also a tie to a simpler time. But what timekeeping has done to us has made us be a whole different species, a whole different way of interacting in the world, a whole different way of living our lives. We can decide whether it was better, what was better about it. We can try to maybe say, maybe on a vacation you should try to do a day without a watch. It's an easy thing to look at a watch and get this perception of time. But what does watchmaking and timekeeping do to us as people, how we live in the world and how we face the world? Maybe we have less time for interactions with people. Somehow we're saving time, but we're losing it as well. So, anyways, I wanted to bring you the thoughts of The Alchemy of Us by Inesa Ramirez. I recommend the book highly. There's a lot more to talk about in that. Thanks for coming to Science Sunday. Do we have any questions?
Quite a few comments, but no real questions. I really like the idea that more accurate time changed our sleep schedules, changed the way that we move about, changed our work schedules. You know, there are so many things that came about in human behavior changes and social changes because of more accurate timepieces. Very interesting stuff, and I'm sure the book is full of other examples of how our inventions have modified our personal and social behaviors.
Right. Yeah, I think that it's hard to fathom because you really can't set up an experiment and determine how we would have lived in the world, how we would have faced this. How do you get an airplane to fly if you're not going to know about steel making and timekeeping and so on? How do you get to Mars and land the precision in which they did the Perseverance Rover is just phenomenal to me, and obviously a lot of it is with enhanced materials and enhanced timekeeping. So there's a lot to be gained by it, and sometimes we run past the things that maybe are at a loss, and maybe part of our pilgrim heritage or something is to find ways to make things better and to fit in, and not always to enjoy and participate in what we have.
Reminds me of the old James Burke series, Connections, where he would start with something like somebody needing a more efficient way to smelt iron or dig a hole in a mine or whatever, and then end up talking about how some of those ancient at least early modern or medieval inventions led to technology that we see around us today that has changed our lives. So pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a big aspect of her book. I think she, as a material scientist, she really wants to explore a lot of that. What did it mean to have better efficiency in steel making and the railroad rails and so on, and how that changed, the whole Oregon Trail thing from months and months, and death by cholera and stuff like that, to get out to travel some places, to nowadays, or to even in the late 1800s when people could travel by train and get to places.
So paraphrasing a question that AJ just typed in, how does this help our survival? Will we survive longer than lions because we can measure time?
Well, when you think of humans are such a new species on the planet, and what we've accomplished in the little bit of time that we've had, it's phenomenal. There's also a cost to that too. We've caused damage to the earth in ways and so on too. Pollution and global climate change and different things like that. I remember snickering at those stupid dinosaurs, when I was a kid and heard about them, and the teachers would always make sure, and the books would always say they had brains the size of peas. They were enormous animals, and so you feel like what losers in the evolutionary scope they are, and here we are, the best of all. And I think that probably more and more involvement in science makes us realize how easily it is to make any species, including ours, extinct.
Someday somebody will laugh at us for having brains the size of cantaloupes.
And not using them. But I mean, and then how do you say a lion or they've been around for quite a long while, and if they die off, is it because of their stupidity or ours?
Yeah.
There's a lot that we have to address, and how to take care of the world.
It makes me think that some of our inventions are dangerous and hurtful to us, as well as some of the same or different inventions are helpful. And it comes down to what are we going to do with the things we build and the capacities that we develop, and that's probably a topic for.
Yeah. Well, you don't want to, science is a wonderful thing, and you and I both love science, but we have to realize it has limits and it has challenges, and it can be used improperly. I was telling you, I'm very happy science developed this vaccine, right? And I was able to get my first dose of it almost 2 weeks ago, and what a wonderful thing. Can tend to work and stop people from the dire effects of a terrible disease. And what wonderful things our science has done for us, and thank goodness for it. And everything has to be taken with a grain of salt or whatever, and seeing how the effects cannot always be beneficial, cannot always be what we even anticipated, right?
Yeah, I saw a news story recently that said they think that humans developed a resistance. I forget whether it was cholera or tuberculosis. I think it was tuberculosis, but humans developed a resistance to common strains of those pathogens over a period of 1,000 years. And I was just thinking, well, I'd hate to wait that long for my, COVID immunity to develop. So.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks so much for coming to Science Sunday. Hope you had an enjoyable time, had something to think about as a result of it, and we'll be here coming up. I think 2 weeks from now, Dave, your husband, is going to talk about...
cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin.
Bitcoin.
So a hot topic in the news. Help us all understand a little bit more about what it is.
And then the Science Sunday after that will be Mark Ailes from the Citizens Climate Lobby and a member of the church here talking about what is going on. I thought it'd be good to get another talk about what's happening now that we're back in the Paris Climate Agreement and what we can do now and what's coming ahead with that. I've heard some positive things. I think Biden said something about some of the concepts that are put out by the Citizens Climate Lobby make some sense to him, and so that's interesting to hear too.
All right.
Great. Thanks a lot. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend, and hope March keeps on getting nicer and nicer for all of you. Thanks a lot.